Hey now, welcome to the 10 Days of Hauntings, my 4th Halloween special. I'll be reviewing 10 horror movies, one every day leading up to Halloween. This year the theme is obviously hauntings or ghost stories. As you might remember, after wrapping up the zombie feature last year, I asked you guys which of my ideas you'd like to see. And it seems that everybody had a different idea, but one comment in particular solidified it for me. The person said, "What represents Halloween better than a ghost story?" That being said, as you know, I'd always like to start these off with an old silent film. I've always kind of had a weakness for films from the silent era, but instead of picking one that I was already familiar with, this time I chose one I'd never seen before, The Phantom Carriage from 1921. This is a Swedish film which for the longest time was considered lost until just a while back it was discovered in a film archive, restored and released to the general public. And man, what a great find it was, because this is honestly the best silent film that I've ever seen. No joke. The film at the time was praised for its special effects, particularly the use of double exposures to make ghosts seem transparent, which even today it looks really cool. But what struck me is not the visuals or even the soundtrack, and I have a bit to say on that later, but the story itself. Usually silent films have to have rather simple plots and a small cast because there was no spoken dialogue and people didn't want to get bogged down with dozens and dozens of title cards. But The Phantom Carriage actually tells a rather complex story with heavy use of flashbacks, sometimes flashbacks within flashbacks to tell its story. I was also interested to see that the ghosts were not the main focus. Although it's certainly a creepy movie with a foreboding presence, it's not so much about the horror of the supernatural, but the horror of the human condition. In the beginning of the film, a young woman named Edith is a sister at the Salvation Army and is dying of tuberculosis. On her deathbed, she wishes for a man named David Holm to be brought before her, but everybody is having a hard time finding David. They send a guy named Gustafsson off to look for him. David is in a graveyard drinking with his friends to celebrate New Year's Eve, and he tells the story of Death's Rider. The legend goes that the very last person to die every year becomes Death's Rider, forced to ride a carriage around for death, reaping souls, and every day on earth to them is like 100 years, and they are only relieved on the next New Year's Eve when somebody else dies at the stroke of midnight. He tells the story of his friend George's, who is extremely afraid of dying on New Year's Eve and became a ghostly servant to death. But it turns out George's did die on New Year's Eve. Gustafsson finds David, but he refuses to see Edith, and a fight breaks out, and David is killed accidentally just as midnight comes. When the ghostly rider comes for him, it turns out to be his friend George's, who insists on making him keep his promise to Edith. Through more flashbacks, we learn that David was a drunkard and a lout who was constantly in and out of prison and corrupted his younger brother to the point that the brother killed someone in a drunken stupor and was imprisoned for murder. He also drove away his wife and his 2 children, and that he's also responsible for Edith's disease, as he had contracted TB, and Edith, who had a crush on him, insisted on fawning over him at the Salvation Army and mending his jacket without taking proper precautions, which is why she is dying of the disease. David is a horrible person who hates humanity and himself, and it negatively affects everyone around him. Edith tried to help him by reuniting him with his estranged wife, not knowing that he sought revenge on his wife for leaving him while he was in prison. He terrorizes his wife and kids, who were afraid of contracting his disease, but he just doesn't care. Georges forces his spirit to visit Edith, who sees death and begs to be left alive a while longer, as she believes she can save David. But she doesn't know that David's ghost is there with her, hearing this. Georges then takes him to his old house, where his wife is at the end of a rope and about to kill herself and the children. David prays to be able to intervene, and Georges allows him to return to life to save his children and his wife. But it's not the cut-and-dry happy ending you'd expect, as his wife has a hard time believing that he's changed so completely, and at the end of the movie he clearly has a long road ahead to atone for everything he's done. Now, I have to mention the soundtrack, as this is really important. Originally, when it was shown in 1921, the movie had no sound whatsoever, which is unusual as it was common for silent films to be tracked with some sort of music. After the film was rediscovered, many people tried to make different soundtracks for it of varying quality, but the official one was done by the drone band KTL, who created the perfect creepy vibe and atmosphere for the film. It's sort of weird to hear drone, a very modern form of music, in such an old film, but I can't imagine any soundtrack being more fitting to the film. The film is broken into 4 parts, so the soundtrack is made up of 4 unbroken tracks, making up the full hour and 45 minutes of the film, always beginning each section with a low hum and an eerie knocking noise. It really gets you in the mood, as you'd imagine it's the sound of Death's rider knocking at your door. I could go on, but I recommend you either hunt down a copy or watch it right here on YouTube, as it is around. I always have fun when I dip back into the silent era, but this is definitely one of the best. I give it a 10 out of a possible 10.